Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the 34th Annual Headwaters Conference. We're so glad all of you are here, those of you in the room with us and joining on Zoom. I'm really thrilled to introduce this year's Headwaters theme, hunting and fishing. And this weekend, what we're looking to do is explore and celebrate the diversity within the worlds of hunting and fishing, and to examine and understand hunting and fishing as providing a unique pathway to environmental stewardship. Tomorrow we've got quite a few events going on. We hope that you join us across the hallway in the University Center ballroom. Topics on inclusivity, food security, including learning how to harvest roadkill to make the most of that great loss. Please consider joining us. And in the evening, we have a wild game cook-off. At the moment, there are 10 competitors for our wild game cook-off, and it's not too late to register to compete. I also did want to clarify that you are welcome to come just to eat. So either consider putting your hat in the ring or joining us to enjoy the foods of our lands and waters. Before I turn it over to my co-organizer of the conference, I also want to thank a number of folks that have helped make this happen. Those include, and this list is not exhaustive, Paul Rivera, who's helping organize the Wild Game Cook-Off tomorrow night. Let's give Paul a hand. And our incredible team in the Clark School, most especially Jillian Bauer, who can't join us today because she's sick, because of all the work she does for us, and especially Lindsay Dolezal. Let's give them a hand as well. Once again, I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight. It means a lot to us. With that, I'll turn it over to the co-organizer, Dr. Salif Muhammad.
All right. Thanks again for everyone being here. I'm Salif Muhammad, and I'll be introducing our keynote speaker for this evening. So Erica Nelson, using she, her pronouns, is based in ancestral Ute Territory, currently known as Crested Butte, Colorado. Erica earned a BA in psychology and a minor in outdoor adventure leadership from the University of Nevada, Reno at Lake Tahoe. Here, she led and facilitated student outdoor courses and developed curriculum for outdoor programming. Erica is currently a fly fishing guide in the Gunnison Valley and has over 10 years of outdoor guiding and instructing, whitewater, skiing, rock climbing, backpacking, hiking, and snowshoeing courses and workshops. She has served as co-chair for the Access and Inclusion Gap Year Association Committee and is a board co-chair for Women's Wilderness and former board member for High Country Conservation Advocates, also known as HCCA. She is an avid whitewater boater, a NOLS instructor, and ambassador for Brown Folks Fishing, BFF, which cultivates community for people of color in fishing and its industry through a lens of equity, justice, and inclusion. Erica's work in the fly fishing industry has been featured in podcasts and articles such as the New York Times, Field and Stream, and Outdoor Business Journal. She considers herself an awkwardly seasoned keynote speaker while engaging in many virtual and in-person conferences, panels, within the outdoor industry, and a frequent guest speaker in academia. In her spare time, Erica hosts the Awkward Angler podcast and authentic series on social justice, fly fishing, and storytelling with folks in the outdoor industry. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to a friend and colleague, Erica Nelson.
Hello, good evening, everybody. It's always kind of awkward when someone's talking about you and you're standing right there. So, thank you. I'm a big fan of awkward, by the way. You're going to hear a lot more about that. All right. Speaking of awkward, I'm actually not that great of an angler. So this is my typical catch, just making sure that other anglers are clear and free of other branches. So if you're worried about catching a log or a branch, I probably caught it before you and moved it out of the river for you. You're welcome. Forewarning, talking about justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion can also get a little awkward. And not to mention, I do get emotional. I stumble over my words, and I'm also nervous, but we're going to have to deal. See me after for your refund for the free conference if you have an issue. I'm excited to share my journey and sharing my identity as an Indigenous woman. I'm actually one of 2 Indigenous female guides in the entire state of Colorado. And I'm excited to share a little bit more about my journey of how I got here. Also, what it looked like for me to gain access to fishing and the outdoor industry, observations in leadership and conservation, and the continual need for representation on historically excluded communities in open spaces and recreation. Hopefully leave some things with you to reflect on, to continue conversations around hopefully leave you with conversations around conservation when it comes to justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. Before I kick this off, I want to share these things called operating assumptions. I travel and do a lot of different workshops around justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And just to kind of get us on the same page, I like to have these operating assumptions before kicking off any seminar or any kind of talk around diversity and inclusion. So what I'm also wanting to basically say is it is not useful to argue about a hierarchy of oppressions. While I'm here to share much about my identity, that is in being a woman of color, being Indigenous, and also a female in the outdoor industry, there is no oppression can be more or less than the other. So I'm not here to play oppression Olympics. And that's because all forms of oppression are interconnected. I don't have all the answers for you here today. And part of my learning journey has been okay with accepting non-closure and paradox, especially when we start talking about different cultures, different backgrounds, what we believe, what we perceive as well. And so accepting non-closure and paradox is important in this work. Also, I'm not here to point fingers or fix blame, on any demographic. I'm just here to share my personal experiences in hopes that they can help us all learn and grow together. I'm also a huge fan of this next bullet point, which is taking responsibility helps everyone. And hopefully you'll see some themes throughout my journey and my story about how that can happen. And when we can take all responsibility for our actions and our behaviors, there's joy to be found on the other side. Justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion work can be hard. And I've built communities where there has been harm, but when everyone can take responsibility, we're stronger together. All right, so I'm honored to be your keynote speaker here today in a place where I currently call home. And that is here, the Gunnison Valley, as you know, sits on the ancestral lands of Ute Mountain Ute and many other tribes that have migrated here through this area. Prior to the name Gunnison, this name had many different native names, and I'm particularly drawn to the name Tamichi, as it was referred by the Utes, meaning a place of rocks and water. The Utes, like many tribes, lived a nomadic lifestyle following migrations of large game. It's likely that the Utes came to Gunnison around the 16th century. Europeans and miners eventually found their way to the area, resulting in disease, violence, and displacement for the Utes until 1879, when the few remaining were forcibly removed by the US government and placed on the Uinta-Ouray Reservation in Utah. After which, Gunnison Valley opened to white agriculture, and the land was then sold at a minimal price to white homesteaders only. Today, you see cattle ranches, hay, and fences protecting their private property. The Gunnison Valley is also home to one of the largest Kora populations in the nation and is a rapidly growing Indigenous community. Many hold important jobs around the valley. When I moved here, there was zero recognition in the Crested Butte that I saw, or really in the Gunnison Valley, that we sit here on its stolen Indigenous lands, not even in the museum in Crested Butte. You'll see a head nod that has since been added after the 2020 murder of George Floyd and the social reckoning where we saw social injustice. I'm not here to take credit for this, but the folks in the Valley that are continuing to educate themselves on why they too get to call this beautiful Valley home. What I'm attempting to do is my own form of land acknowledgement, and I want to address things that I experience both as a diversity consultant, outdoor professional, and as an Indigenous woman. I often get a lot of questions about, is it okay to start doing a land acknowledgement? Should we add one to the website? How do I go about doing one? Do I need to be inviting an Indigenous person to do this? I've observed that folks spend so much time worrying about getting it right that they don't even stop to ask, not only why is this important, but why is this important to me? Sitting with this is the first step, even including asking yourself the question, is this to absolve myself from some sort of guilt, fear of missing the bandwagon, or to attract more diversity? I personally wish to see more individuals and organizations move past the performance and make it part of our ethos. How are we learning, connecting, and taking action versus stating words? The Utes and other tribes have lived and migrated through this valley well over 500 years prior to colonization. There is an inherent relationship between these tribes and the land and the water. Working in the outdoor industry, as well as observing the way Native American studies are taught or not, US history has always seemed to start at 1800. I think about those 500 years in comparison of knowledge that Indigenous people had prior to ranching, farming, and privatizing land. I encourage us all here to reflect on what it means when we look at conservation efforts. How are we looking at strategies and expanding beyond a 5 or a 10-year plan, but looking at 7 generations from now? There's an exercise I like to do, which is placing myself as a 4th generation and taking a look and reflecting back on the previous 3 generations. What decisions were made when it comes to land stewardship and conservation, and what are the current impacts today? Using what we know now, how can we let the past inform us on the future for the next generations and beyond? A land acknowledgement goes a long way beyond just a head nod of naming tribes that used to live here. How are we taking the time to honor that Indigenous people and knowledge are still around? How many people work in conservation and land stewardship that have Indigenous leaders at the table? How many organizations are in relationships with these tribes? If there isn't one, how are we going about establishing one and working on reconciliation? Speaking of reconciliation, I recently took away from an Atlantic article by Graham Wood that said, asking an Indigenous person to write your land acknowledgement is like getting them to write the receipt for the land you stole from them, while having no intention of giving it back. In 2021, there was a push in South Dakota as Mount Rushmore violated the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, and the tribes want the land back. They were offered compensation, however, they're refusing it, and they're asking that Indigenous people return to hunting and stewarding the lands while others are still allowed to use it. What would that look like if Colorado Open Spaces was no longer wondering if a land acknowledgement should be done, but more focused on how we can honor the past and build genuine relationships with the land, the water, and Indigenous people that were here before us? If not returning, how are we reflecting on land acknowledgement is part of our, how are we reflecting on how a land acknowledgement is part of our ethos versus a conference opener and not forgotten, and then forgotten about till the next one? Instead of worry about getting it right, how do we shift our focus on learning about the current day impacts of colonization has made to tribes, or go even deeper on why we're even possibly even charging them to fish and hunt their own homelands? And are these programs, these outdoor recreation programs, how are they in conversation and relationships with Indigenous people as well? The final point I want to make on land acknowledgements is that also is that the US government has done a lot of horrific things to Indigenous and Black people, and it has not been forgotten in our communities. And it impacts so many current disparities, including being left out in hunting and fishing. And it's interesting because it's always been a part of our way of subsistence living. So to wrap this up, I want to reiterate the importance of personal and organizational reflection by asking, why is this important to me? Are we willing to reconcile painful and awkward history to build relationships with original land stewards? How am I willing to share or give up power to let others lead these efforts? These reflections are part of taking responsibility. Again, I don't have all the answers for you, but I'm going to continue to ask, am I willing to take responsibility for my own learning or unlearning of my local area's history? Shifting gears, I was born and raised in Farmington, New Mexico, which is in the Four Corners where Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico meet. I was also near one of the largest reservations in the US, known as the Navajo Nation. And I never really grew up outdoorsy. So I actually couldn't wait to leave the desert. And this is actually a picture of my dad, my cousin, and myself fishing the San Juan. My father always tried to get me into fishing, but I got extremely frustrated. And at one point, I just remember as a kid throwing the pole in the water and never touching a rod again until about 7 years ago. And so it's funny now that come full circle, that's all we do, especially when he comes out here. He's a frequent visitor to fish this beautiful valley. So not growing up outdoorsy, it wasn't until I was around 18 when I moved to Provo, Utah, actually. And I started picking up hiking. And if you didn't know, shocker, that hiking is actually just walking around outside. So as I got more into hiking and exploring these beautiful valleys and these beautiful canyons in Utah, I decided, what would it be like if I took a sleeping bag or a backpack or a tent and just started to sleep outside. And so I thought, where's the most awesome, incredible place that I can go to try this thing called backpacking? So I decided to wrap up 2 years of college in Utah and buy a one-way ticket to work in Denali, Alaska, to be able to do a summer job and try this thing out called backpacking. It didn't matter that I didn't know how to read a map or or what gear to buy. I was just really excited to be outdoors and do this awesome thing called backpacking. So I actually made a little video compilation about my first backpacking trip.
Breaking news, we have been told of missing hikers have been found just moments ago in Denali National Park. Late last week, Erica Nelson and Abby Plant went missing, and now they are just moments from a nice reunion with family members. The helicopter carrying Nelson and Abby Plant headed down to Denali National Park. This is a Fox News alert. 2 female hikers lost in the Alaskan wilderness are safe. They have been found. Abby Plant's 25 and Erica Nelson, 23, have been lost at Denali National Park since Thursday. We are definitely thrilled that look at momentum. Don't be easy. Look at race. They have quite a picture. There's a picture they were coming. Thank you.
Whoops. So, testing, hello. All right, whoops. So that was my first backpacking trip. Embarrassingly enough, made national news and was one of the largest search and rescue party in national park history. To make things even more exciting, my sister was getting married the next week, and I missed the flight to help her out before the wedding. She actually got married on time. So we were rescued on a Thursday, flew to Houston on a Friday, and she got married on time on Saturday. So nailed it. So as interesting and intense as an experience this was actually a life-changing moment, believe it or not. And so I thought, if I can survive this, not only in my own frame of thinking of staying positive and dealing with the elements, collecting rainwater, melting snow, and really relying on, I was also with a friend, Abby, so really relying on somebody there to kind of keep our spirits up was a really incredible moment. And so when we made it alive, looking back and reflecting of what went wrong, and I thought maybe I should learn how to read a map. So I decided to kind of change my trajectory and look and focus in working in outdoor education. And so I spent a little bit of time after Alaska working in a corporate environment doing hospitality management. And this situation in Alaska kept hanging over me of how can I give back when there were so many other search and rescue parties that left their families in order to put mine together. How can I take responsibility for that big incident? And so I decided to flip over tables, rip off the corporate jacket, and start Erica's Revolution. So hashtag Erica's Revolution was becoming and facing all of my fears. And I have 3. So my 3 fears were whitewater, dealing with kids, and animals. So I decided to immerse myself in a whitewater guide school, and it was the most incredibly terrifying and exciting experience. Living off pure adrenaline and PBR for 7 days was definitely ideal. So the things that I kind of gained out of whitewater boating, and I did this on the American River in California, and I found out that there was actually some transferable skills to be had. So I felt like I learned to become a better communicator, especially through a class 3 rapid or 4, and you need people to paddle. Who knew you needed to actually raise your voice and be directive? Decision-making on the fly was also something that needed to happen. And also risk management and how I'm managing these instances that I found myself in. I also gained a lot more confidence, and I ended up building a really incredible community. When I started river guiding, I actually had a lot of women mentors, which is something I didn't really reflect on until a couple years ago, actually, of thinking about my journey through outdoor education and recreation. And there was actually a really big supportive group of women that would say, work with the water and don't try to overpower it. Then we would sit on these eddies and watch these men try to overpower these rapids and flip, and it was really funny. So I ended up doing a bunch of swiftwater rescue courses, found myself in some gnarly situations, some pretty close calls, and that really kind of wakes you up to a different reality. But because I had the education and skills, I was able to kind of navigate those situations a little bit better than what I went through in Alaska. I also was thinking, wouldn't it be really awesome to go on the Grand Canyon? So that was always kind of a goal of mine as well. I decided to immerse myself also in leadership development. And so I went and picked a college to finish my undergrad, and that was located on the North Shore of Lake Tahoe. At the time was called Sierra Nevada University. They have since now moved to the University of Nevada, Reno. So here I also gained some other skills. There was also a partnership with NOLS, the National Outdoor Leadership School, where I was required to actually take a 21-day canyoneering course. And so that's kind of when I got connected with NOLS. I ended up going to work for the NOLS headquarters as their marketing manager, and then becoming a whitewater instructor as well. And so that was a pretty awesome journey to also work on technical skills and facilitation and leadership as well. Throughout my journey, still in continuing in outdoor education, I kept noticing these things that this thing kept kind of coming back of why things feel a little off. And when it came to different things and working in the outdoor industry, I noticed that while I had a lot of women mentors, there really weren't many people of color. There weren't many other ethnicities or LGBTQ communities that I came across, differently abled bodies, or even other introverts. Spoiler, I'm also a really big introvert that's always put on stages like this, so it's always really awkward. But people also seem to separate themselves from nature, almost like we were not part of nature, but we were separate from it and almost even superior to it. There was this conquer mentality that I didn't quite understand where this was coming from, whether it was using it's interesting that you use a lot of violent words like I'm going to crush it, right? Or I'm going to send it. Or just this language was always so fascinating to me of wanting to conquer something versus be in relationship with. And also the concepts of wilderness and untrammeled land when we're recreating on stolen indigenous lands, where we're recreating was likely where indigenous people migrated before, and there was no mention or head nod to that whatsoever. And again, it seemed to always have a theme that history started at 1800. So fast forward, I ended up getting my Grand Canyon trip. Woohoo! So I had a friend call me and say, hey, there's a deadline to put in for a lottery and it ends in 30 minutes. Do you mind if I list you as an alternative troop leader? Turns out about an hour later, we got the permit. So I don't know why people are griping that they never get permits. It's not that hard. Come to find out, I didn't realize people have been applying for 20 plus years and never get one. So I always find that a funny and interesting story. So so actually this picture was taken earlier this May, where I got to do my second trip down there. And this trip was a little bit more special. It was I'm in a different place than I was a few years ago, the first time I did this. And taking a look at the from an Indigenous perspective and how it's so inaccessible to get down there, even though the Navajo, which is my tribe, you still need a permit. You still have to go through the process to visit my own ancestral lands. And so there's currently 11 federally recognized tribes in the Grand Canyon, when there used to be so much more before they established national park. So there was a lot more displacement of Indigenous communities in order to have a national park. And so as I was going on this trip and preparing, I was trying to find a good book, but everything that I came across was about conquering the fastest descent or some colonial lens, and nothing that's in relationship or that came from any of the federal recognized tribes that currently still live there. And I also found it interesting. My mother passed last year, and I went to spread her ashes at the Navajo sacred site of the Little Colorado River confluence. I kind of sort of laughed how hard it was to get to return her to the birthplace of our own tribe, as well as the Hopi tribe as well. So if you've ever done this trip, you know how expensive it is, how hard it can get to be down there. But to be able to explore my own homelands, I have to go part of that system as well, which I found quite interesting. So as a response to many of these issues that I was seeing, I co-founded REAL Consulting. REAL is an acronym for Reconcile, Evolve, Advance, and Lead. This is my business partner, Sydney Clark Whittington. She currently lives in Casper, Wyoming. And I love hearing her stories about being a black woman in Casper, because there's not very many people of color up there as well. But we met while working at the National Outdoor Leadership School in Lander, Wyoming. She was the diversity and inclusion manager, and I mentioned I was the marketing manager. We found it really important to partner and work together, because if we had any new courses, any new campaigns, anything coming up, I thought it was really important to partner with the diversity and inclusion manager to make sure we're doing it equitably, making sure we're doing it right, and get her perspective and her thought partnership on any marketing efforts that came out of our office. Unfortunately, we were also met with a lot of pushback from our leadership. And at the time, there was a lot of discomfort in talking about diversity and inclusion. So we decided to launch our own consulting firm as a response, because we saw other organizations in outdoor spaces actually craving and looking for ways to become leaders in diversity and inclusion, but didn't know where to start. So we ended up just kind of starting this as a response to that and do it ourselves. So we've been able to work with varying organizations, government institutions, nonprofits, conservation spaces, and it's kind of all over the place, law firms. And so, and I just kind of want to have this side note of at the same time, while we were launching this, I used to play professional disc golf, which is very random. And when I moved to Wyoming, there wasn't very many courses. And so I was thinking, what is everyone doing? And so it turns out everyone just went fly fishing after work. So I got on, I thought, hey, that could be fun. And so I needed a new hobby. So I decided to take advantage of all the gear that we had at NOLS and picked up a fly rod and decided to just figure it out. So I leveraged my resources, went online, looked up YouTube. So I tried to learn off YouTube, but much like here, Wyoming doesn't get great cell phone service. And so anytime I was out on the water, it was, what did they do in that video? I don't remember. And so it was really interesting. At the same time, I noticed all the content that was out there were like old white guys, like who's Tom Rosemar? And so, or who are all these people in the fly fishing? And it didn't see much representation when it came to education as well. And so, as resourceful as I am, simultaneously, I was also on Tinder. And while I was on Tinder, if you don't know what Tinder is, it's a dating app. And there was a lot of guys holding fish. And so, clever Erica, what if I just swiped right on every single guy holding a fish? And then they could answer all my questions. And so that's what I did. And so because Wyoming is the least populated state in the US, I'm pretty sure I met all of them. And so very upfront about my intentions to learn how to fly fish, I eventually found a fish mentor. And I also got to explore a lot new waterways around Pinedale, Jackson Hole, and northern up in Sheridan as well. So Wyoming is a beautiful place to learn how to fly fish, by the way. And I got to learn new skills, and I finally learned how to actually catch a fish and take it off the hook. So yeah, I got hooked. And through that process, I learned if somebody isn't necessarily wanting to go that route, how do they get into fly fishing? And so learning that fly fishing isn't easy or accessible for all. It was my goal to increase awareness and education around this. And so I ended up starting an Instagram account called Awkward Angler. And Awkward Angler has two different meanings. One, I didn't realize that getting tangled and slipping in rivers and falling and catching trees is actually quite normal than with those beautiful videos and magazines show. And so why don't we talk about that? That it's okay to actually go out and not catch a fish. The second issue was, or the second reason for the name Awkward Angler was talking and sharing my experiences getting into fishing. Yes, I did have mentors. Yes, I did cultivate community. But at the same time, I got a lot of stares. I had a lot of racial incidences that happened to me. I had a lot of sexist comments thrown at me. And I wondered if this happened to anybody else. And so I decided to just talk about it. And turns out that's awkward. Because when we're so comfortable in our culture, in our spaces, and we're part of the majority, we actually don't really see the minority or what other people face. And so that's why I started and cultivated that community of Awkward Angler. So fast forward, I ended up connecting with a wonderful group called Brown Folks Fishing. And Brown Folks Fishing is a community-based organization that is by and for Black, Indigenous, and people of color anglers. So this is not just fly fishing, but it's every type of fishing that you can think of. So tenkara, spin, these bait fishers, deep sea fishing, spear fishing, etc. And they're a community all over the world. And there's a pool of ambassadors that are spread throughout the US and Canada. And we decided Real Consulting would also partner with Brown Folks Fishing. And we all co-created the Angling for All Pledge. And so this is the first people to sign on, Orvis, Patagonia, United Women on the Fly, and Casting for Recovery. So this is a program that kind of addresses that benchmark for learning or unlearning. And a lot of these organizations really wanted to do good. They really cared about diversity and inclusion, but they didn't know how to get started. So we developed a program to how to bridge that gap. And so it's a commitment for over a year. CEOs and executive teams need to be involved, and it's not a one-off program. But it kicks off with a full-day workshop that explores our own individual identity, our organizational identity, how to build more authentic community, and how to decolonize the industry. And so, again, these were our first clients of Real Consulting, and we're still continuing to work and partner with them today. And this was back in 2019 that it was launched. So some projects actually, for example, the way that some of these organizations use the pledge, I'll give an example about Casting for Recovery. They're an organization that gets women with breast cancer out fly fishing. And so no matter what stage you're in, if you've gone through breast cancer, it's a free program. That's a pretty sweet retreat, all expenses paid, and you get your own individual guide as well. So it's a pretty cool program. But what they were seeing was not a lot of women of color, especially Black and Indigenous people. And so some of the things we worked with them were helping them reflect about the history of mistreatment of women of color, such as sterilization that was ordered by the US government for Black and Indigenous women. And so when you understand these really deep roots of this disconnect of why we're not seeing these people, this is kind of the work that we consult and work on to dive deeper into. And so they're starting to expand their programs that kind of address these issues to start building trust with medical care professionals and women of color. Another thing that I just was kind of tired that I noticed was that a lot of white men were being celebrated, not just historically, but even today. And that's catching large trophy fish and destination trips. Not that there's anything wrong with it, and I love that, but that's not what the stories that I really want to hear. When I was studying outdoor leadership, it was interesting. I asked this question of why am I hearing so much about John Muir and this fairy tale story of Sacagawea and Pocahontas versus the truth of their kidnapping while they were so young and forced into marriage and sexually assaulted. Why didn't I know about Dr. Sarah James and her upbringing in Arctic Village in Alaska, or her relationship with the caribou? Chief Manuelito's side of the story of his horrific surrendering to Kit Carson, or the story of Red Cloud, being the first Lakota native to win the battle during the US colonization. So even today, I'm wondering where these stories are of Black and Indigenous and people of color within the hunting and fishing industry. So I decided just to launch my own podcast and hear the stories I wanted to hear. So as I started building communities, I would get into these interesting conversations, and I thought, what would it be like to just hit a record button and give this to the fly fishing industry? I've been hit with an overwhelming positive response, and that it's pretty funny, hard-hitting, kind of all of the things. But the Awkward Angler podcast is an authentic series about social justice, fly fishing, and storytelling with folks in the outdoor industry. And so likely you've never heard of my guests, and that's kind of the way I like it, because you get to hear these stories that you likely won't hear. So representation has also become a theme in how important it is, because I didn't see other people in the water that looked like me. I've often felt uncomfortable and again dealt with racist and sexist comments and behavior. I thought it was important to be the representation and start mentoring others. I also wanted to see my sister's kids know that there's a space for them in this industry if that's something they choose to do. Since I've been doing more outreach, I've been working a lot with youth now, and it's so interesting how they pick up the skill so fast. The picture on your left is my niece and nephew kind of in the corner. And this was just a program that I did in Atlanta, Georgia a couple weeks ago, which I'll talk a little bit later about. I've also found fulfillment in becoming a fly fishing guide. I actually took a few years of a break from guiding. I felt a little burnt out. I thought I was done. I thought I was going to walk away from it and just start enjoying things for myself. But I kind of at first saw it as somewhat of an obligation, but now I see it as an honor to be the representation on gold medal waters. As mentioned, I'm also one of 2 Indigenous women guides here in the state of Colorado. So finding this representation, not only in the industry, but also guiding is very important and special to me. I work on requests only out of Willowfly Anglers, and the majority of my clients are women of color, transgendered, and queer identities. Some other programs that I work with, I'm involved with this program called Fish and Feathers. This is a pretty sweet program that gets Black and Indigenous and people of color to do this internship program, which is a process to help them become either a park ranger or to work for the forest or National Park Service. And so here is a weekend clinic that I do every year in Estes Park. And I get to teach them how to spin fish and fly fish. And then they also do another component of leading hikes and birding. And then they go on to their internship, which is on a national park, and that can be anywhere in the United States. And then they have to develop programs to teach other people how to fish and bird and hike as well. I also just created this program in partnership with Arrowhead Adventures and Real Consulting. We call it the Decolonizing the Rogue, a leadership experience. And when working at NOLS, we met a couple that eventually bought a rafting company called Arrowhead. And they've always also didn't want to just run regular whitewater trips the way that the traditional way that you see. They wanted a little bit more meaning to them. So they brought us on to develop a new course. And it's a beautiful course where it's 3 days, 4 nights on the wild and scenic Rogue River in Southern Oregon. And what it comprises of is leadership development. And the way I'm not saying diversity and inclusion because I feel like diversity and inclusion is a basic leadership skill. And so we call it a leadership workshop. And we learn about the history of the Rogue River. This picture on the left, we're looking at a tribal elder. He is doing a tobacco ceremony right before we launch. And this is just one of the groups, this other picture. And so the elder does a brief history of the Rogue River. And throughout the course, we're learning about not just the Rogue, but other histories when it comes to Indigenous removal, but also the impacts of that and what that looks like today. And so we've been able to partner with Southern Oregon Land Conservancy and also Travels Southern Oregon. And again, this kind of talks a little bit more about what's happening modern day of what happened back in the day. And so it was a really beautiful trip. This next slide has a little video on this right side. And what we're looking at here is this white fence is a marked grave. And it has a sign. It says Pioneer. Oh. And it expands over to this disc golf basket. So the sign says it's a marked grave. In 1990, a Swedish miner got with the wrong maiden, and here is his grave. And there's a plaque there, there's a sign there, it's fenced in. Whenever we were standing around this disc golf basket, We learned that this was, we also invited another elder, Robert Kenta, and he was there the entire trip. And this was actually part of his traditional homelands of the Siletz tribe. And if you can see where the disc golf basket is, there's kind of like a divot there. And that's actually how they built their homes. They would dig these holes and they would build their houses around these holes. And oops, there, the disc golf basket is in the tribal elders and leaders' home, which is the biggest. And so you're kind of hit with some pretty profound disrespect of these native lands. And it was pretty hard hitting to see the impacts of that, of kind of nonchalantly putting recreational equipment in a very sacred place. And so it was kind of interesting to then look at what's the Siletz tribe up to, what are their things that they're facing and challenges in their tribe today. So that's kind of part of the course that we dive into. And also, how does this relate to their conservation organization when they're looking to build better relationships with the tribes? And so they actually didn't quite have the best relationships at the beginning of this course. And then they were able to start a reconciliation and onto a better path after this course. Other programs, I do a lot of women's clinics and kind of get to travel all over for those. That was a really beautiful women of color canoe fly fishing trip in Ontario. And that was in partnership with Brown Girl Outdoor World. And also working with adventurous women. I showed up at this women's conference and I wasn't expecting so many Indigenous women to be there. So that was a pretty awesome experience. This last program, I had mentioned that I was in Atlanta, Georgia. This is called All Kids Fish. And this was developed by a woman named Rebecca Sue Klein. And it's her mission to get more involvement with youth from historically excluded communities. And so they recruit a lot of youth. There was 30 kids and 30 guides. So each kid got their own guide. And in the morning was spent on skills, casting, learning about bugs, learning about how to get started in fly fishing, your gear. And then the afternoon was spent on the water with your one-on-one guide. And that was a really incredible experience because the ages were anywhere from around, I'd say 8 to about 13. So that was a pretty impactful experience. And believe it or not, Alaska let me in for a second time. And so I got invited to go to Bristol Bay, Alaska to be a guest instructor for the Bristol Bay and Fly Fishing Guide Academy. And so this is a pretty cool program sponsored by Trout Unlimited. They recruit Indigenous youth from all over Alaska and train them how to be fly fishing guides. It's a 7-day program where they don't even know what fly fishing is, and they have to end by fully guiding an entire client. So they have to learn all the basics of fly fishing, including tying their own flies. And so by the time their client day comes, they need to have a box full of flies for their clients. And so it's a pretty immersive and awesome program, let alone you're going to Brooks Lodge in Katmai National Park, and you're flying to all of these really cool destination places. And they also get to learn about the industry if that's something that they choose to do. And the purpose is for conservation and sustainability as they grow to inherit land, or they can learn how to build in their economy, whether it's guiding, starting their own service, or working in a lodge. This experience was really awesome because this last slide was a lot of the Indigenous women. Some of them are white passing, but and that was an interesting conversation that we had. And I got to learn a lot about their ways of life and how much they depend on the salmon. And so if you're not familiar with Pebble Mine, it's this mine that keeps coming up to basically do some mining that can destroy the salmon population and their subsistence way of living. I also found these women to be quite insightful, interesting, and just all around amazing. So I created a mini podcast series, and this was sponsored by Trout Unlimited. And this is just talking about their traditional way of living and how to protect the salmon and the campaign of No Pebble Mine. This recent project, this summer I was up in the Arctic National Refuge. I was invited to be part of a film project, but also working and living with the Wichin tribe in Arctic Village, Alaska. It was a really awesome experience. Here on the left, this is some kids that were out playing in the summer, and they came over for a midnight snack. And so it's probably around 12:30 a.m. On that picture. And we got to kind of just be immersed in the community. They had some community events. There was lots of food that was shared. There was a lot of laughs. This is actually Dr. Sarah James. She does a lot of work and education around the caribou migration. She's been doing a lot of work around the Willow Project and protecting their way of life as they rely on the caribou. And so we also got to learn a lot from Dr. Sarah James, where she taught us how to learn how to live off the land. So we did a lot of harvesting, we did some fishing, and it was really insightful to just be in her presence and learn from her. This was the group of women that were with me on this project. And I've also incorporated a lot of my own ways of respecting waterways where we recreate. Typically, if I have a big group or if I'm teaching a clinic, I like to do a sage smudging and also an offering to the water in the lands that we're recreating on. And I was able to share that experience with these ladies here. There's a film coming out next year called Mother that is film directed and produced by Chad Brown. And he is the founder of Love is King and Operation Rome. And he's based and located in Portland, Oregon. And the story is around Dr. Sarah James and basically having her mentor us and learning and how we're harvesting off the land, but also different profiles about being a woman of color in the outdoors and in fly fishing. Some other industry partners that I've been working with, I got to work with Travel Brazil over the last year. And so that picture is actually taken down in the Amazon. And these are just some of the clients that have also signed on to the Angling for All pledge in different ways that I'm getting immersed and getting to be able to fish in these beautiful places. I mentioned who's Tom Rosenbauer. He's actually one of my buddies now. So I've been able to become an Orvis ambassador. I'm an industry partner and also an Orvis endorsed guide. I got to fish with Tom in Vermont, and we also had a live podcast going on for a little while. So we called it Awkward and Clueless, and that was featured on YouTube and Facebook. And I was also, while I was in Vermont, he invited me to his podcast studio, and we got to record an episode about finding the right guide. So he's become a really great, important person and mentor in my life over the last few years. So if we're talking about creating access and looking at all these different elements of diversity and inclusion, I always have some people of like, what can I do? And so one is, how can you actively listen? If you're having questions, how are you actually listening? Are you listening to respond, or are you actually actively listening? Looking and interrogating our own bias is also a great start. What kind of blocks are coming up for us if we're so resistant to a new paradigm of thinking? Are we actually striving to build genuine relationships, or is this for clout, or what is it for? I found that if we focus on relationships versus the transaction, a lot more gets done. Saying hello and invite us on your boat. So I heard this at a conference of it was somebody asking a group of people of color of, what's helpful for you? And they're like, just take us on your boat. We want to go too. So it's as simple as that. Sharing resources, whether that's a monetary value, look at resources that you have, but also sharing resources within your own communities. Looking for opportunities to uplift historically excluded communities. So are we actually open to disparities happening in this valley? Or are we kind of sticking to our own people and our own communities? Also support when people ask. I notice a lot of folks like to revert to where's the data, or prove me wrong, or prove me right. I need to know that this is happening and I need proof of this. And so maybe try entertaining that these stories and these things are happening and these disparities do exist. And are we actually listening? Ooh. This one always hits me hard. All right, so there's also some real barriers that other communities face, and maybe this can answer a question as to why aren't we seeing them out on the water? Why don't we see them outside? This is a real phenomenon of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And so this is a barrier that I personally have faced when it comes to being alone in the outdoors, and part of the reason why I work on request only. And so how are we creating safe spaces for all identities and genders? And so there's some statistics here that Indigenous women are being murdered at a higher rate than other demographics. And so these are things that I have to carry when I'm recreating outside. So if you're looking for some tools, a lot of people like to ask that question before a workshop, or how to navigate spaces in diversity and inclusion. And I kind of like to revert to this thing called technical versus adaptive challenges. And so I think that we as a people default and love technical challenges because we can find technical solutions pretty easy. A technical solution is the onus is on the authority figures and experts to apply the solution to the challenge. So for example, if you want to learn how to fly fish, that's pretty technical. I can teach you how to do that. It's actually not that hard. It's the catching the fish that's the hardest. But you can kind of learn how to do the thing, walk away, and not have to deal with it ever again. 2 + 2 always equals 4. If we have a problem with our computer, we can call IT. We have somebody that we can just throw our issues to, and it'll get figured out. Adaptive challenges, on the other hand, require learning to identify the problem and the solution. The onus is on all stakeholders to apply the solutions. And that's where we kind of sit with discomfort when it comes to diversity and inclusion and figuring out why aren't we seeing more folks of color or different demographics in our spaces. So adaptive is an iterative, adaptive process. And there's really technically, it's more of a circular thing, whereas the technical starts at point A, ends at point B, and we're good. Adaptive is continual iterative work. And sometimes you actually don't even find the actual solution. And when you do, things shift, things evolve, things change. And so you have to adapt again and try a different solution to a new challenge. And it's not up to one person to figure out. This takes a collective people to be able to find the challenge and the solution all at the same time. And so I think that's kind of where we get stuck, is we revert to this technical solution mentality. If I just found the root of unhoused people, if I just found the root of racism, we can just do X, Y, Z and move on. And so unfortunately, it doesn't work like that. And part of the discomfort of adaptive challenges is we actually don't have a guideline or a guidebook. And so there's opportunity for messing up and making mistakes. But the real diversity work is in the recovery. So understanding that you're gonna mess up, likely fail. Are we willing to get back up and join the conversation again and do the work? And that's always uncomfortable. So how can we make room for JEDI, Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Initiative? And this requires adapting that new paradigm of thinking, of approaching an adaptive challenge and an adaptive solution. Adopting, and there's also no timeline because again, this is an iterative adaptive process. Culture change starts with taking individual responsibility, leaning in with curiosity, and create and maintain and invest in networks of accountability. So how are we not only holding ourselves accountable, but each other as well when we mess up? So there's a parable by David Foster Wallace, and it goes like this. There's two fish swimming along, and an older fish swims by and says, "Hey guys, how's the water today?" They look at each other and they say, "What the hell is water?" And they run. So a lot of this is kind of the water that we're navigating the water, the air that we're breathing, like the water that we're swimming in. And I really like this quote of there are no rules. A lot of people come and say, just tell me the solution. They come with a pad and paper. I'm just gonna tell me what to do. Unfortunately, there are no rules. There are only context and consequences. And so are we willing to take responsibility for those consequences? And I'm saying consequences and not always a negative thing. Are we just ready for the impact of our actions and our behaviors? Lastly, I want to leave you with a philosophy called Hojo. This is in my culture, a philosophy way of living. And this is just finding balance and harmony in everything. So rethinking technical approaches to conservation and adapting this adaptive approach. How are we living in balance and harmony with all living things as well as each other? And so walk in beauty is also the phrase that refers to the Hojo philosophy. And it's kind of my philosophy that I've adopted when it comes to guiding. So if you're looking to chase monster trout in the catch and release section, I'm all for that. But I'm also going to give you some other things to consider of how all things are connected. How are we in relationship with the climate, the water levels, the bugs, the air, the birds that are around. And so looking at all these different things of what it takes to connect with a fish versus just the fish. And so fly fishing to me isn't just about the biggest and the greatest or even just catching. It's about the relationships with people and the environment that I'm surrounded in. So looking at things of conservation, the technical approach would be, how are we saving these waterways? How are we saving the riverbanks? How are we saving the fish? But really, how do we actually look at conservation when it comes to conserving our hearts, minds, compassion, and conserving empathy? Thank you.
All right, so we're going to do a quick setup here, and then we'll be taking some questions. You've probably noticed the QR codes on the backs of the chairs in front of you. You can scan those and submit your questions there, and I'll be delivering those to Erica on the stage here. So just give us one moment, and then we'll get that process started. If you'd like to go ahead and start submitting your questions, that would be perfect. I think so. There's a slide with the QR code also for the question. Yep. All right. There's the QR code as well for the questions. Hey, it's a little bright with the projector. If we could, yeah. Can everybody? Are the QR code good if we take it off the screen? We're good with that. Okay, cool. Kate, what does the icon for the app look like? Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. Here's a good question that I think is also representative of a broad issue, but is asked in a specific way. What are your thoughts on non-Indigenous people smudging with white sage or Palo Santo? It'll take a second.
Oh, there we go. Thank you. Well, I think again, I don't have I am not here to say yes or no, because again, my philosophy is taking responsibility for your actions and behaviors, and are you willing to accept the consequences of that? And I think it's important to educate ourselves on things that we're doing. Smudging in general is for everybody, and that's not for Native people to gatekeep or hold for ourselves. And so I find a lot of great connections in sharing that with other people, and you can't make anybody do that. But I love to share that. Now the white sage is also, and the Palo Santo is currently a resource that's being diminished right now. And so it's not very my words right now are not coming to me, but it's a rapidly declining in its growth. So we're running out essentially. And so some of that I would consider is, are we leaving enough for those Indigenous tribes that use that for traditional and ceremonial purposes? Or what's the reasoning for taking of a natural resource that's depleting right now? So that's just kind of comes with some education around that. So that's kind of where I would sit with that. So
Thank you. Another one, I'm going to take a little liberty just editing this question, but not changing its meaning. So what advice for someone categorized as white, but actually has Hispanic, Italian, Irish, and Native American heritage do you have in navigating outdoor recreational spaces? People assume my ethnicity.
yeah, that's got to be really hard. And thanks for sharing that vulnerability. I can't speak on really white passing, because I've always grew up in spaces where people have treated me different because of the way that I look. And so I don't know if I can actually speak wholeheartedly to that experience that you have. And I think identity is an interesting journey. And I think that's why we have our workshops planned out in this route, is we want to just jump to action right away and do the thing, but without reflecting on our own journey and our own identity. And so it's a path. And I'm sorry, I don't have a answer for you other than identity, and that journey is hard and it's not easy. And so interrogating that, what that means to you. I do have a lot of white passing friends that have chosen the other Indigenous woman guide is white passing. And so she's also at the same, shared with me that that's also something she navigates, but she's also very proud of her Indigenous culture. And so that's, to her and for me to support and uplift that. So find your communities and find those that value you in your culture and in your own identity that you want to celebrate.
Thank you. How accessible are your programs, or how easy is it for a person of color to discover them?
I've been very fortunate to be invited to these programs. And so I've gained a lot of access by building relationships. And so my name gets passed on by word of mouth. That's kind of how I ended up in Atlanta a couple of weeks ago, was just through some networking. And I've never met Rebecca Sue Klein, but it just kind of happened to be within the industry of figuring out who I was. And so I've spent a lot of time growing my community on Instagram and online. And so connecting in that way is ways that I've got access to a lot of travel and a lot of different programs. I'm really excited that can't share a whole lot of details, but there is a path that I'm taking to be able to create more accessibility for programs, because it's really difficult, especially when it comes to maybe starting your own outfitting, because permits and things are very limited. It's really hard. And so really just trying to navigate that, I feel yeah. And so I think just the way that I've been able to navigate is through relationships.
As a female in fly fishing, how did you deal with the sexist comments or general put downs about your gender?
Yeah, at first I thought it was just in my head. Like, is this happening? Especially in Wyoming, I remember like learning how to back up a trailer, for example. That's so intimidating when everybody's watching you. And so let alone a lot of men like telling me how to do it, and or even being on the river and, you know, do you know how to drive that thing? And not knowing that I've had a plenty of experience navigating whitewater, and this is just class 1 on a jerk boat. This is easy. And so really it takes it very frustrating, and it still continues to happen. And especially I'm kind of the odd one out on the Gunnison River sometimes, because I have very flamboyantly gay people on my boat sometimes that are not very quiet. And so I still get the looks, I still get the comments, I still get all of that. And I think just being confident and comfortable in your own identity is something that I'm good with. Knowing that I'm getting out and doing what I love, and also learning to pick your battles. I think this is just comes with being a woman of color. I've had to deal with these things my entire life, not just in fly fishing and not just the outdoor industry. It's an extra emotional burden that I've learned to just pick my battles and tune out. And I'm also quite witty, so don't mess with me.
This person's asking as a recreation major and as someone who has very little acknowledgement and understanding of Indigenous peoples. How can there be better education or acknowledgement in this academic field?
I think I mean, students have a lot of say in where they want their institutions to go. How are you advocating for that in your programming? How are you speaking to your president and your faculty members that this is important to you? And it's going to continue to stay status quo unless you actually rock the boat and break some barriers. So are you brave enough to actually step up and start seeing some things, even if you don't actually know exactly what you want? Getting these conversations started, seeing if there's other student body out there that are also interested in these things in your program, and really just starting to network and connect with them to be able to start raising their voice.
This next one is, as a white person, how can I support diverse representation without taking someone's spot or promoting white saviorism?
I love that, because I think there's really no solution to that. It's really figuring out your why is this important to you? And if it's, take a project, for example, and you might see it on this borderline of white saviorism, looking at who's not at the table, what other programs are out there, what other communities could be possibly doing the same thing. Is there somebody that can come in and be interested in joining or leading these efforts? And sometimes there's not, and maybe you are the right person for the job. And I can understand that can be absolutely uncomfortable, but it's keeping constant updates of what's happening in this world or realm of work that you're working in. And so I think just, I don't think it always has to be people of color leading. It is always refreshing to see other white folks even engaging in DEI conversations and leading those efforts. It doesn't always have to be on the burden of the marginalized community. And so maybe you are the right person, but always continuing to educate yourself and looking for other people in the same work that you're doing is also really helpful.
Have you found challenges working with companies, for example, Orvis and Patagonia, to get them to engage in real change versus just gaining positive DEI publicity?
Luckily, having my own consulting firm, I can choose to not work with those people. I'm very fortunate to have clients really setting them up for success to doing the work. I think all the work, if we take Orvis, for example, there's a lot of internal things happening that you're not always going to see as a consumer. And so I think a lot of this work takes time. It takes organizational culture change. And you're not going to see this action right away. And so knowing the inner workings of things that they're working on, how they interact, how they're shifting their culture is things that I'm starting to see from my perspective. But I know to the public, that's probably not something that you're seeing because again, these things take time. This relationship started in 2019. And it's still stuck with a lot. This training and this other efforts that they've done have stuck with them, and they're grounded on that. And that's really awesome to be able to work and partner with an organization like that.
As a woman in a guiding field, what 2 pieces of advice would you give another woman moving into a guiding position?
I'd say, what I wanted to say, I was going to say something. No, kidding. That's exciting. I think it's really important to connect with other women. Again, my experience was super positive and having positive women mentors. And so finding a mentor is kind of also a theme that I've had throughout my career and also working in the outdoor industry. And so if you can find a mentor, that would be a really great path and a great step. And then also be curious and also start small. You don't have to like launch yourself fully into a thing. For example, like hiking. You don't have to climb Mount Everest to get started. You can start with walks in the local park. And just starting to build on that is the ways that I've kind of got into this industry, was starting small. So you don't have to always go full send, but really just taking your time.
Thanks. And I kind of like this one, especially the question part at the end. So thank you for sharing your story. I hear your experience and affirm the need to only serve clients by request. What fish or bug do you love or relate to most?
One of my absolute favorite things to fish for is going up towards Gothic in or on the upper slate and catching these really tiny brook trout. I even carry a goldfish net. And so so I just think it's fun. It's kind of the I guess micro fishing is kind of my jam. Because there's just such like we live in this gold medal water. I can catch big fish anytime, but how do I connect with like the finer things in life in this valley? And so finding those really bright colored brookies are one of my favorites living here. And I would say I am full fan of the mop fly because it gets so much like backlash. But it's the only tie I fly, or the only fly I can tie and choose to because it's funny and I like getting the looks and kind of going against the norm around here, or that attitude that you have to match the hatch or you have to do this and you have to do that. So I'm just kind of like, I'm just going to do my own thing and I don't care what you think. So I'm just going to toss mops.
Cool. Nice. Very nice.
Wait, followed by a big hopper. So big hopper and droppers the mop. It's the way to go.
Yeah. Hopper dropper is definitely my go-to in all seasons, not just the summer. Let's see. I had one picked out and then lost track of it. I'd love to hear more about your work with and how you got involved with Women's Wilderness, their incredible organization.
Ooh, so I served as board chair and co-chair, and I recently stepped down as a board member. So there was an open call to serve on the board, which I haven't seen before. most boards that I know and how they do board recruitment is by who you know. And so this was an equitable effort of board recruitment. I was very fascinated by that. I also knew a previous board member who had a terrible experience, but through her experience, seeing what they're doing, I was curious about the shift in their own cultural change and their own work in becoming anti-racist. And so after being curious and asking questions, I saw an opportunity to be part of that culture change. And so I got brought on as one of their DEI professionals to do an assessment about the organization. And I've been able to lead some pretty cool things over the last couple of years. And so we just hired the first Black woman executive director, Christy Peoples, and we've been able to kind of start doing some more diverse programming. And it's just really exciting to see the transformational growth whenever you center DEI as an organization, when your board is leading those efforts. And so it wasn't easy, but it's awesome now to, again, this work can be hard, but there's joy to be found on the other side. And so there's a lot of great programming and new stuff coming up, and the executive director is just the best person to be leading that organization.
Awesome. That's really cool. You mentioned Indigenous people have to pay or have a permit to explore their ancestors' land. Would you change this if you could? And if so, how?
I mean, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I hate every year, every what, April 1st, we have to get our licenses, and I'm like, man. So I do think, again, systemically there's a problem. Systematically, current day, there's so much tied, and it's a hard process to break because those fees help, it impacts a lot. And so it's not an easy flip to switch. That's an ideal, but I honestly don't really work in those areas, but I've been getting more involved with the state parks and different efforts of where I can start getting a seat at the table to start having those discussions. And so it's something I would love to see in the future. I don't know how it can be done though, but I'm looking to see how I can bring my own chair.
Cool. Would you be willing to speak more about the details regarding getting lost in Denali?
Sure. Yeah, just stoked on a backpacking trip. And then, one of the things, again, reflecting, was not having an appropriate map. And one of the things we did like the thing you're not supposed to do, which is keep hiking. And so while we kept going, we convinced ourselves that where we were at on the map, you can convince yourself that you're anywhere on a map, by the way. So, and also that maybe we just underestimated the terrain. And so there was some times where it was actually fun. It was also really scary. It was times where I physically felt my body shut down. And I didn't think I was going to make it out at certain points. I had a camera that could also take pictures and record. This was before awesome cell phones. So there is a moment Abby and I recorded messages to our families, and not being able to contact a very worrisome mother that when I missed my flight, I knew she was freaking out, and just not being able to communicate that we're okay, we're still alive. And during the search and rescue, it actually turned into a search and recovery. And it was actually blasted on national news that it turned into a search and recovery. So my friends, back home in New Mexico were watching the news, and hearing this was it was very hard. It was a very hard time. In the moments that I could get myself to snap out of it and be positive and force myself, it was interesting to observe my body have a lot more energy. And so really, I kind of just default to positive thinking. I'm a big optimist. I think just because of that experience. And so I've also have an interesting relationship, or I've had an interesting journey with empathy because I'm like, life's not that hard. I almost died. You know, you're not limited to your basic resources. It's going to be okay. And so I've had to kind of work on that over the years, but also just going through the situation of with my family and how that really impacted the relationships that I've had. It just grew us closer together because it was a positive outcome. And it was interesting because whenever I had my cell phone with me the whole time, it just wasn't working, and I would try to turn it on and off again. And we finally got to a place where I actually had service. And I called my mom, let her know I was going to be a little late to the wedding. And she picked up and was in the park superintendent's office, and they were actually going over a briefing about the recovery. And so it was kind of like this looking at a ghost on a phone, and we were able to again, this is exactly where we're at, come pick us up. So 6 hours or 8 hours later, we actually hiked 40 miles out of their search zone. And so it was a little interesting to come to terms that maybe we were a little lost. And when we were in the helicopter, the pilot was saying there's been a little bit of media, and didn't realize that it was this big thing happening back home. So yeah.
Quick follow-up to that is, have you gone backpacking again in Denali?
Yeah, I have. Yeah. And actually that Arctic village trip was part in the village and then part backpacking in the refuge. And so that was the last time I was backpacking in Alaska.
So we'll just do a couple more questions, and kind of one that was here a while ago and just came in are kind of connected. So I'm going to try to word these into one. So the first one, I'll kind of read them both together and let you just kind of answer them jointly. So how can diversity and Indigenous inclusion be better represented specifically in the Gunnison Valley? And then that's the first one. The next one is, what's the best way to reach out and include Indigenous peoples in projects and decision-making on the Western slope?
Okay, I might need you to read that second, but I'm going to answer
Okay,
first real
go
quick.
for the first, yeah.
And maybe it'll intertwine. Does it say increasing representation?
How can diversity and Indigenous inclusion be more represented in the Gunnison Valley specifically?
Interestingly enough, I did a community workshop in Crested Butte a few years ago. And after that, 2 years later, somebody reached out. They own a lot of property and asked how they can start giving it back. So I thought that was pretty cool. And so we've been working on giving up some of the ranch, and how, and there's also other folks with a lot of property that, how did they get that? I hear a lot in this valley that I'm a 5th generation rancher. And again, how did you get that ranch? It was only for white settlers only. And so it's inherently a racist founding of this valley. And so how are we reconciling that? And how are we, whenever I go fly fishing and drive the Taylor Canyon, it's just so much private land. And again, trying to become my own outfitter, it's incredibly hard. So how are we looking at either having Indigenous people manage land around here? It's not necessarily giving up your entire property, but maybe bringing in different resources or other land stewards, or inviting people onto your property. That's one thing I would love to see in this valley. And I think as a guide and outfitter, I think that's really important.
Second one again. What's the best way to reach out and include Indigenous peoples in projects and decision-making on the Western slope?
I would kind of flip that around and say, how can you be involved in what other Indigenous people are doing? And again, I think that's kind of that, do you need to be the one leading those efforts? But what's actually going on in this valley? How are we educating ourselves of the populations that are already here, like the core indigenous people, or other folks that are around. There's also a nonprofit called Melanin Mountain Project, and that is getting more folks involved either here or coming here to help tourism when it comes to more representation. And so are you looking out for these programs? How are you being involved? How are you donating either your time, money, or resources to these programs that are already happening?
How did you find Crested Butte?
Oh gosh. Okay, so don't hate me. All right, I went back to corporate. Okay, so I was recruited by Vail Resorts. I worked for Vail when I lived in Lake Tahoe for a season in HR. And when they bought the resort, they called me to do the change management for the resort. And so I ended up having, I ended up finding housing really quickly, actually. And it seemed like a great opportunity. And visiting here, and I fell in love immediately is exactly what I needed. And so having left that position, it's been somewhere that I want to stay, and it's where I'm probably going to be for a while.
So I have two more. Are there other podcasts, resources you recommend for folks who want to learn more?
Learn more about diversity inclusion, or
I think, yeah, diversity, inclusion, and justice in outdoor recreation in general, and the kind of surrounding topics that you covered tonight.
Yeah, there's Faith Eve B. She's a Black woman in Portland, Oregon. I believe it's Trails to Trails is her podcast. Outside Voices, there's a woman of color that does that podcast. And probably a few more that I could probably rattle off. But I can't remember. But there's plenty. I think just searching that, actually, I've been able to find plenty.
And final question, and thank you for all the questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but I tried to kind of get the ones that are representative of clusters of questions. But final question, what are you seeking next to do for yourself and the communities you want to inspire? Not the communities you want to expire. Sorry. Inspire.
Personally, right now, I'm coming off of a really personal, hard year. I mentioned my mother passed, but there's other things that follow that. So stability is really important to me right now. I've been typically on a flight, every other week. And so it's actually nice to be here, to be home, and to start building more local connections, because I have a lot of connections out everywhere else. And so really immersing myself in different projects that are happening here, such as Melanin Mountain Project, looking at different ways of guiding for next year. So there's some projects, again, I can't really speak to right now, but there's a lot that I'm excited about in the future.
Thank you so much for being here. Everybody, let's give Erica a nice warm thank you again. Looks like my family sent in just a shout out to me. So I'm just going to say back to my family at home, W-dub. And for the rest of the conference tomorrow, we're starting at 10 a.m. In the UC ballroom right across the hall. We're starting off with a panel on diversity, equity, inclusion in hunting and fishing, entitled How to Make Hunting for Everyone. Then we'll have a lunch, and then we'll have a talk after lunch entitled The Ethics of Violence, and that's by Dr. Brian Bernhardt. And then we'll have a couple other sessions on how to spread the harvest, so how to use hunting and fishing to address food insecurity issues, and then opportunities for that students and other people might want to know about in the hunting and fishing world to get more involved, jobs, things like that. And then obviously culminating in our wild game cook-off from 5 to 7 p.m. tomorrow in the UC ballroom as well. Again, you can still sign up for that if you look at our flyers. They're on Instagram, they're on the Headwaters website. So otherwise, thank you for being here tonight. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow. And thanks again to Erica, our featured guest today.